Why do artists skip over Florida when they're on tour? That's a question that I get a lot from my students, and there's a somewhat of an explanation to that. So let's dive into it. Let's talk about why artists skip Florida. So to do so, we need to look at a map, and Florida right down here. So if you kind of zoom out a little bit on the map of the United States, Florida is kind of just dangling down there on the bottom southeast corner. And here is why. So the biggest markets around Florida, if you kind of zoom in on the map a little bit, you have Houston over here in Texas. And then the next closest big market or major market will be Atlanta, right? New Orleans is not a major market. I used to work at House of Blues in New Orleans. And I can tell you it's a very competitive market. House of Blues has a lot of venues, an amazing local scene, but not a lot of people live in New Orleans, and the average income in New Orleans is not that high either, right? So it's actually not a market, so or a not even a B market, right? So a lot of artists may go from Houston and they'll cut up to Dallas, and then maybe start making their way east from there, right? Or vice versa. They're coming from the Northeast down to Atlanta, and then they will maybe cut up to Nashville, and then they'll cut over to Texas, right? Sorry for the camera issues, by the way, but not like you need to look at me. It's the least important thing to look at. Anyways, so they kind of cut somewhere across this whole northern portion, right? And usually maybe skip even Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida, right? So all three of them get skipped. So Florida's not by themselves. So here's the reason why. So for starters, let's look at a drive from Houston to Orlando, right? From Houston to Orlando, that's 13 hours, almost 14 hours. So 14 hours essentially, and almost 1,000 miles to go from Houston to Orlando. That is a really, really long drive, right? And if you're traveling with trucks and buses, every semi truck and every tour bus on average costs about $1,000 a day. These days with higher gas prices, maybe a little more, right? Maybe $1,200, $1,300 a day. And this includes days off. So if you're traveling and you're not playing a show that day, that's a day off. Drivers can't drive more than, I believe it's 8 hours in a single day, right? Which means to go from Houston to Orlando, you have to take a day off, right? So you have to stop somewhere in the middle. A lot of times, a lot of these markets here along I-10 are really tough, right? And artists may try to play New Orleans, but even New Orleans to Orlando, that's still a 10-hour drive. So New Orleans is not far enough, right? So you would have to in order to not have a day off, you would have to go to Mobile, maybe Pensacola, even Tallahassee. That'll be too far from Houston. So you're going to have a day off in between there, right? Even if you're a band doing it in a car, you still need a day off. Now, Pensacola, Mobile, Tallahassee, they're not very strong markets. Mobile and Pensacola, they're small markets, even much smaller than New Orleans, and it's really hard to get people to go to shows there. Tallahassee, a college market, it's very hit or miss. When college is out, nobody's there. When football season's on, people are going to see FSU. That's just what's happening, right? So a lot of artists don't have a lot of options to play here. What about Gainesville? It's the same thing, right? It's a college town. Now, Jacksonville is hit or miss for a lot of artists. A lot of artists don't do very well in Jacksonville. Now, you do have St. Augustine once you get bigger, and a lot of artists do play St. Augustine Amphitheater because it's just such a beautiful, prestigious place to play. But you're talking about for most artists coming all the way down to Orlando, right? Now, once you're in Orlando, to get back out of Florida, right? So if you start or end your show in Orlando, it's now a 7-hour drive from Orlando to Atlanta, right? And include a stop in there. You're talking about 8 hours on the road. So even for trucks and buses, yeah, you could do it in one day. It's pushing it, but it has been done and is done all the time. But here's the other issue, right? So why not do Orlando? So if Jacksonville's hit or miss, why not do Orlando and Tampa? Well, for certain shows, Orlando and Tampa, they're within less than 100 miles from each other, right? And so there's a thing called a radius clause. And a radius clause prevents artists from playing within 100 miles 60 days before or 60 days after a show. So most artists will not play Orlando and Tampa, especially at the bigger scale, right? Once you're talking about 2,000 and up, it's very rare you see artists playing in both markets. Now, club level, yeah, you could have someone playing both Orlando and Tampa, right? But then once you play Orlando and Tampa, for example, the next market that's a major market in Florida is going to be Miami. Now, Miami is a hip hop, EDM, some mainstream pop, and also for hip hop. we're not talking about like the cool backpacker indie hip hop, underground hip hop scene, right? We're not talking about any of the cool stuff or old school hip hop even. We're talking about like very, very mainstream hip hop, right? Stuff that's playing on radio still. So radio is still kind of relevant for hip hop, and the artists that are playing on radio, they do well in Miami. Anything else doesn't really do Miami, right? Latin does really well in Miami. So Latin, hip hop, pop music, EDM, those are the genres for Miami. Most other genres don't tend to do well down there. Plus, Miami is 4 hours from Orlando, right? So now you're talking, if that's your last stop, you're talking about driving from Miami all the way up to Atlanta. So that's 4 hours plus the 7 hours. So you're talking about 10, 11 hours to get from Miami to Atlanta. So that's why it's very expensive to go down to Florida for artists. It's a lot of gas to go all the way down into the peninsula. It takes a lot of time, right? So if artists don't spend the time developing Florida, they kind of just tend to continually skip over it. Now, I have seen in the performing arts center world, and even some club artists, where they've really developed Florida, right? So there's a lot of performing arts center artists. They'll go to Jacksonville, they'll play Florida Theater. They'll go to Orlando, they'll play the Dr. Phillips Center. They might even go to Melbourne and play the King Center. They'll go to Tampa and play the Strass. They might even go to, or instead of Tampa, they might go to the St. Pete and play the Mahaffey. In Tampa, they might also play the Tampa Theater. So you have a lot of options in Tampa and St. Pete. There's also the Ruth Eckerd Hall and the Capitol, right? So there's a lot of theaters in that little pocket right here where artists will play. Some will drive down to Fort Myers and play the Barbara B. Mann. They'll head over to the West Coast or the East Coast of Florida and will play the Broward Center in Fort Lauderdale, and sometimes even in addition or instead of Broward Center, they might go down to Miami and play places like the Olympia Theater, right? So you can really make a lot of money and spend if you have developed Florida and you spend an entire week in Florida. And same thing even at the club level, right? There's artists that will play in clubs and they will play Tallahassee and Gainesville, and they might play Jacksonville, Tampa, Orlando, maybe Sarasota now, right, which is an up and coming scene. And then they'll head over to Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and they'll spend time developing Miami, right? Miami is a great market if you spend time developing it. If it's not a genre that does really well in Miami traditionally, as long as you spend the time developing Miami, you'll do really, really well in Miami. So that's kind of why artists skip Florida. It's just very expensive, and if you don't to come down and come all the way back up, and unless you spend time developing it and investing in the market, it's just going to be very, very challenging or very expensive to develop the market, right? Unless you're a superstar artist and you can come play Tampa, Miami, or Orlando, Miami, and in a stadium or an arena, you make enough money to make it worthwhile. But that's essentially why most artists skip Florida. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comments. Always happy to answer questions. If there's any content you want me to cover, happy to talk about that as well. And until next time, go see shows, meet people, make stuff, and spread love, positivity, and kindness in the world. Peace, my friends.